The night air was thick with humidity, wrapping around the neon-lit streets of Hong Kong like a suffocating second skin. In the distance, a sign flickered a dancing cartoon kitten, its pink bow vibrant even in the grime-stained alleyway. Hello Kitty, innocent, childlike, and soon it would be the last thing she would ever see. Fan Man-yi staggered out of the rundown nightclub, heels clicking on the broken pavement. Her arms were thin, her cheeks hollow, the ghost of a smile lingering from whatever chemical had dulled the hunger gnawing at her gut. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body, clutching the cheap synthetic leather as if it could shield her from the monsters that roamed these streets. Fan Man-yi staggered out of the rundown nightclub, heels clicking on the broken pavement. Her arms were thin, her cheeks hollow, the ghost of a smile lingering from whatever chemical had dulled the hunger gnawing at her gut. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body, clutching the cheap synthetic leather as if it could shield her from the monsters that roamed these streets. Chan stepped into the light, a grin splitting his face. "Fan," he called. She turned, blinking blearily. Recognition flickered in her eyes, then fear. She turned to run. They were faster. Hands grabbed her arms, twisting, yanking. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the churning city noise. A few pedestrians glanced over and kept walking. No one wanted to get involved. No one ever did. They shoved her into a battered van. The door slammed shut with a final, echoing clang. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was that damn kitten, waving at her from a grimy window. The apartment was a hellhole. Peeling wallpaper, the sickly sweet stench of mold and sweat. A flickering bulb casting long, leering shadows on the walls. In the center of the living room sat the shrine, a grotesque altar dedicated not to gods, but to greed and madness. It was covered in Hello Kitty memorabilia, dolls, posters, bedsheets. A child's fantasy twisted into something grotesque. Fan was dragged inside, her wrists bound, her body trembling. "You owe me," Chan sneered, pushing her onto the filthy floor. "And you're going to pay, one way or another." The first blow came swiftly, a backhand that split her lip and sent her reeling. The others laughed. It was only the beginning. Days bled into nights, indistinguishable in the windowless room where Fan was kept. They beat her when they were bored. They starved her when they remembered. Sometimes they forced her to smile, snapping Polaroids as if documenting a macabre scrapbook. At night, the dolls stared down at her with glassy, unblinking eyes. "Smile, Fan," Chan would hiss, shoving a Hello Kitty mask onto her bruised face. "Be a good little girl." She tried to obey. She tried to survive. But the fear rotted her from the inside out. She wasn't alone. She could feel them, things lurking in the corners of the apartment, whispering, watching, things that fed on pain, on terror, on despair. The line between the living and the dead had blurred long ago in this place. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, Fan lay on the floor, bleeding into the cracked linoleum. She closed her eyes and tried to will herself away to anywhere but here. That's when she heard it, a soft giggle. She opened her eyes. Standing at the foot of the mattress was a little girl, no more than 6 years old. Pale skin, black hair hanging in limp strands. She wore a Hello Kitty dress, stained dark around the hem. Her eyes were wrong, too black, too deep. Fan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The girl smiled a slow, splitting smile that seemed to tear at the seams of reality, and reached out a tiny hand. "Come play," she whispered. Then the world went black. Days later, the beatings stopped. Not because they had tired of her, but because Fan had stopped responding. She was dead, or close enough. Chan stared down at her limp body, frowning. "Dumb bitch," he muttered. "Now we don't get our money." Lao shifted nervously. What do we do?" Chan thought for a moment. His eyes slid toward the kitchen. "We get rid of her." With brutal efficiency, they set to work. Knives flashed, bones cracked. The bathroom became an abattoir. When it was done, what was left of Fan was stuffed inside a giant Hello Kitty mermaid doll. The kind you win at a carnival if you're lucky, or cursed if you're not. They stitched it shut with trembling hands, the synthetic fabric puckering over blood-soaked stuffing. The doll smiled serenely, but the whispers didn't stop. They got louder. Sometimes, Chan woke in the middle of the night, heart hammering, convinced he heard footsteps padding down the hall. Sometimes he caught glimpses, a shadow darting around a corner, a tiny hand slipping out of view. The dolls moved when no one was looking. The Hello Kitty shrine, once a symbol of childish innocence twisted by adult cruelty, had become something else, a portal, a curse. Fan had not left. She was still there, and she was very, very angry. The first sign was the smell, rot, thick, cloying, impossible to scrub away. No matter how much Chan bleached the floors, no matter how many cheap incense sticks he burned, it clung to the walls like a living thing. The building itself seemed to wilt under its weight. Neighbors, already used to the sounds of muffled screams and heavy footsteps, began to whisper. Something was wrong in apartment 3B. Something worse than the usual darkness that festered there. But Chan didn't care about whispers. He cared about money. And the only way to get more was to keep the operation running. Drugs, gambling, debts, collected with fists and knives. Business as usual. As if the girl's death was nothing more than a stain on the carpet. But the stain kept growing. It started small, a misplaced lighter, doors creaking open by themselves, lights flickering even when the bills were paid. Chan chalked it up to paranoia. He told himself ghosts weren't real. Superstition was for old women and fools. Until the doll moved. One night, after a long day of hustling and bleeding out desperate men, Chan stumbled home drunk. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow of the TV playing static. He kicked off his shoes, muttering curses, and headed to the bedroom. The Hello Kitty doll sat on the couch, its stitched mouth smiling at him, exactly where he had left it. Or so he thought. When he woke, hours later, the doll was at the foot of his bed, watching. He tried to laugh it off. Maybe he'd moved it while drunk. Maybe Lao or Lung had played a stupid prank. He berated them the next day, throwing punches and slaps like candy, but their wide, terrified eyes told him they were just as clueless and just as scared. That night, it got worse. He dreamt of her. Fan standing over him, her battered face split open in a rictus grin. Hello Kitty mask, half melted onto her skin. Her fingers dug into his chest, clawing, ripping, pulling something black and screaming from his ribcage. He woke screaming, sheets soaked in sweat and blood. 3 long scratches marred his chest, fresh and burning. The doll was perched on his chest, one limp paw pressed against his heart. He hurled it across the room with a shriek. It thudded softly against the wall and slid to the floor, smiling. Lung was the first to crack. "I can't stay here anymore," he sobbed, pacing the living room, his hands trembling. "I hear her at night. I see her in the mirrors." Chan slammed him against the wall. "Shut up." But even Lao was pale, his eyes darting to the corners of the room where shadows seemed to twitch and breathe. That night, Lung tried to leave. Tried. He made it as far as the stairwell before he tripped, or was pushed. His neck snapped like a dry twig. His body sprawled grotesquely on the concrete steps. Officially, it was ruled an accident. Chan knew better. The doll sat at the top of the stairs, one paw lifted in a lazy wave. After Lung's death, the apartment seemed to come alive. Whispers slithered through the vents. The Hello Kitty posters peeled themselves off the walls, revealing gouged, bloody scratches beneath. Doors slammed, windows shattered without warning. And the dreams grew worse. Chan saw Fan everywhere. In the kitchen, clutching a butcher knife. In the bathroom mirror, mouth yawning open in a silent scream. Sometimes he would feel hands on his shoulders, cold and heavy, dragging him down, down, down. Lao started talking to himself, muttering frantic apologies to the empty air. Chan caught him one night, kneeling before the Hello Kitty shrine, weeping. "She's here," Lao whispered. "She's watching, she's angry." Chan beat him bloody, but it didn't help. Nothing helped. One night, Lao disappeared. No struggle, no note. 1 minute he was there, rocking back and forth on the couch, muttering nonsense, and the next, he was gone. The only thing left was the doll, sitting neatly where he had been, a small red bow tied tightly around its neck. Chan was alone now, alone with her. The city pressed in on him. Everywhere he went, he saw her in reflections, in crowds, in the twisting shapes of smoke rising from gutter fires. His mind frayed at the edges, unraveling like cheap thread. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The apartment rotted around him, a festering wound on the face of the city. And still the doll smiled, always smiling. One night, the final night, Chan decided he couldn't take it anymore. He would burn it. Burn the doll, burn the shrine. Burn the memory of Fan Manyi from existence. He poured gasoline across the floor, soaking the couch, the walls, the pile of dolls grinning up at him with plastic eyes. The Hello Kitty mermaid doll sat atop the heap like a grotesque queen, regal and terrible. Chan lit a match. The flame danced, hungry and eager. He threw it. The room exploded into fire, heat sucking the air from his lungs, black smoke coiling like serpents around him. He stumbled back, laughing, screaming, sobbing. And then he saw her. Fan, rising from the flames, her body charred and broken, but her eyes burning with cold, pure hatred. She opened her mouth, and the fire swallowed him whole. When the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but ashes, no bodies, no bones. Only a single unscorched relic sitting among the ruins. A Hello Kitty doll, its smile serene, its glass eyes reflecting a fire that had never truly gone out. Waiting, watching, hungry. It was a rainy night when Sarah and Jason stumbled into apartment 3B, both eager for a fresh start. Jason, an aspiring writer, had landed a new job at a small publishing house. Sarah, his girlfriend of 2 years, had recently quit her job as a nurse. The chaos of the city was a welcome change to the sleepy suburbs they'd left behind. Here, there was noise, energy, and the kind of excitement that seemed to promise something more. The apartment wasn't much. Old building, bad plumbing, the kind of place you could afford with a paycheck from a second-rate job, but it was theirs, and for them, that was enough. They'd heard the rumors about the apartment. People had said it was haunted, cursed. The rent was cheap for a place in this neighborhood, and that should have been a red flag, but they shrugged it off. Who believed in ghosts? Jason didn't, and Sarah wasn't about to let some silly superstition ruin their first night together in the city. They set to work unpacking. Boxes were torn open. Clothes were hung in the closet. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the silence, a soft, comforting reminder that life was moving forward. The bedroom was the first room they set up. The bed frame was creaky, but it was sturdy enough. Sarah was already putting the duvet on when Jason wandered off to check the bathroom. It was when he stepped into the hallway that he felt it, a coldness that clung to his skin, a chill that was out of place even in the oppressive humidity of the city. The hallway light flickered. "Sarah," Jason called, his voice uneasy. "Did you?" She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Jason said, staring down the dark corridor. "It just feels wrong, like it's too quiet." Sarah smiled, trying to brush off the tension in his voice. "It's just a building, Jay. You're being paranoid." But Jason wasn't so sure. That night, after they had settled in, things started to change. It wasn't anything drastic at first. The sound of footsteps outside their door, a door that creaked open by itself. At first, they brushed it off as the building settling. It was old, after all. But as the days passed, the sense of unease grew stronger. They began to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that echoed from the walls. At night, when the apartment was shrouded in darkness, Sarah would wake up to the faint sound of someone moving around the apartment, a soft shuffle, like bare feet on the wooden floors. Jason, though half awake, would swear he saw something moving in the shadows, something tall and thin with long dark hair. "Just a dream," Sarah would whisper, though her voice was thick with doubt. But it wasn't just a dream, it was real. On the fifth night, Sarah woke to a sudden, sharp pain in her wrist. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. For a moment, the room was still. Then, she saw it. A small, pale hand reaching from the darkness. It wrapped around her wrist like a vice, cold and clammy, the fingers far too long. Sarah screamed and jerked back, but the hand pulled harder, dragging her toward the edge of the bed. "Jason," she cried, but her voice was strangled, caught in her throat. Jason woke with a start, his eyes wide with panic. But when he reached for her, there was nothing. No hand, no cold fingers, just the empty air. "Sarah?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. "What the hell just happened?" She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. I felt it. Something grabbed me, something cold." Jason shook his head, trying to reassure her. "It's just your mind playing tricks. We've been under stress with the move and everything." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The next morning, they decided to take a walk to clear their heads. They left the apartment, heading down the narrow streets that snaked between the tall buildings. They tried to talk, tried to laugh, but the unease was still with them. It was as if the city itself was pressing in, suffocating them with its heat and noise. As they passed a small alley, Jason stopped, his gaze fixed on something. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice tight. "Look." Sarah followed his eyes to a small shop at the end of the alley. It was tucked away, hidden between two other buildings, its windows obscured by dust and grime. Above the door was a sign, faded and chipped, reading, "Antiques and Oddities." "Let's check it out," Sarah said, her voice light, trying to distract herself from the feeling that gnawed at her. They entered the shop, the door creaking loudly behind them. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and must. The shelves were lined with strange trinkets, antique dolls, old furniture, and odd knickknacks that seemed to stare back at them. But it was the far corner of the shop that drew Sarah's attention. There, sitting on a dusty shelf, was a Hello Kitty doll. But this wasn't like any Hello Kitty doll Sarah had ever seen. The eyes were black and hollow, like deep, empty wells. The stitching around the mouth was uneven, twisted into a grotesque smile, and the fabric, it wasn't soft like she expected. It was rough, almost like burlap, as if it had been made from something much darker. Her heart skipped a beat. "Jay, look at this." Jason's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. "That's creepy." But before he could touch it, the shopkeeper emerged from the back, an old man with a hunched back and pale, watery eyes. "Ah, I see you found my special collection." Sarah felt an uneasy shiver crawl up her spine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man smiled, his teeth yellow and uneven. "That doll, it's special, dear. It's been through many hands." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man's eyes gleamed. "It's not the doll that's important. It's the story behind it." "How much?" Jason asked, not bothering to hide his discomfort. The old man's smile widened. "For you, it's free." But Sarah wasn't sure. Something about that smile. It felt like a warning. Later that night, after they returned to the apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The doll, that damn doll, had come with them. It sat on the couch, waiting for something. And as Sarah lay in bed, she couldn't help but hear the faint whispers again. Whispers that came not from the walls, but from the doll itself. And that smile was the last thing she saw before the darkness took her. The night passed in a haze of darkness. Jason woke to find the apartment shrouded in an eerie silence. The kind of silence that pressed in on your chest, making it hard to breathe. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very walls of the apartment were holding their breath. Sarah was gone. At first, Jason thought it was just another one of her late-night wanderings. But something about the emptiness in the room unsettled him. The bed was cold, the blankets thrown aside as if she had bolted from it in a hurry. He stood up, his heart thumping in his chest, and stepped into the living room. The Hello Kitty doll sat in its usual spot on the couch, but Sarah wasn't there. Panic surged through him. He rushed through the apartment, opening every door, every closet, but she was nowhere to be found. "Sarah," he called out, his voice cracking. There was no answer. Jason's eyes flicked to the doll. Its black, hollow eyes stared back at him, an unsettling emptiness that sent a chill down his spine. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. He glanced at the clock. It was nearly 4 a.m. Frantic, he grabbed his phone and called Sarah, but the call went straight to voicemail. Again and again. Jason's hands shook as he dialed once more. Then the whispers began. Soft, low whispers that seemed to rise from the corners of the room, from the very walls themselves. They weren't in English. They weren't in Cantonese. They were something else, something ancient. Jason spun around, his mind racing. Where was Sarah? And then, through the din of whispered voices, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A soft giggle. It was coming from the hallway. His footsteps echoed in the corridor as he rushed toward the source of the sound. The hallway stretched long and dark before him, the light flickering erratically overhead. The door to the bathroom stood ajar, a sliver of blackness peeking through. Jason's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place, but he couldn't. Not without Sarah. He pushed the door open, and then he saw her. Sarah was standing in the center of the bathroom, her back to him. Her hair hung in front of her face, wild and matted. Her clothes were torn, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her body trembled as if she were cold, but her breath came in heavy, ragged gasps. "Sarah," Jason whispered, his voice barely a breath. "Sarah, what's happening? What did you see?" She didn't respond. The bathroom was dim, the only light coming from the flickering bulb above the mirror. And as Jason stepped closer, his heart stopped. The mirror, it was cracked, no shattered, in a pattern that seemed too deliberate, as if something had been trying to get out. And there, in the shattered reflection, he saw it. The Hello Kitty doll. Its grin was wider now, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural malice. It was no longer sitting idly on the couch. It was moving. Sarah suddenly let out a horrible scream, her body jerking violently. She collapsed to the floor, writhing as if something invisible was dragging her down. Jason rushed to her, his hands shaking as he tried to lift her. "Sarah, stay with me." "What's happening?" he cried, his voice breaking. But Sarah was no longer responding. Her eyes were glazed over, her mouth open in a silent scream as her body contorted in unnatural ways. The whispers in the apartment grew louder, filling the air with their terrible, maddening hum. Jason grabbed her, pulling her into his arms, desperate to get her away from whatever had taken hold of her. But when he turned to leave, he froze. The hallway was filled with dolls. Hello Kitty dolls. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. All staring at him with those hollow eyes, their stitched mouths frozen in cruel smiles. The room was spinning. "Get out," Jason shouted, but the dolls didn't move. They just stared, their eyes dark and void. The whispers grew louder, echoing around him, pulling at his mind, scratching at his sanity. He looked down at Sarah, her face twisted in terror, her body shaking violently in his arms. "Please, Sarah, please," he begged, but she didn't answer. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as her body jerked one last time and went still. Jason's heart stopped. Time seemed to stretch as he stood there, unable to move, unable to think. The dolls were closing in on him, their tiny limbs jerking as if they were alive. He could hear their whispers, now clear and unrelenting, filling his ears. "Help us, help us, help us." The words weren't spoken in English. They were ancient, guttural, a language that felt wrong, twisted. The walls seemed to pulse with the whispers, and Jason could feel the air closing in around him, pressing on him like a suffocating weight. He turned, frantically searching for a way out, but the door, the only door, slammed shut with a deafening bang. The walls began to close in, narrowing around him, his vision blurred. His hands trembled as he tried to push against the walls, but they were solid, unyielding. The dolls were right behind him now, their small faces twisted in grotesque expressions. Their eyes were too dark, too deep. They were hungry. Jason felt something cold grip his wrist. It was the doll, the Hello Kitty doll. It had reached out from the shadows. With a final, desperate cry, Jason tried to tear away, but it was no use. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Sarah's face, her eyes empty, staring up at him from the floor, her mouth moving, forming one final word. "Run." The apartment was silent again, the dolls scattered across the floor like forgotten children's toys. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, unaware of the horror that had taken place inside the crumbling walls of apartment 3B. But something had changed. The curse was not done. It had only just begun. The city had no idea what had happened inside apartment 3B. Sarah and Jason were gone, swallowed by the darkness, their screams lost to the walls that had once been their shelter. But the apartment itself remained unchanged. as if it were waiting for something or someone to come next. And it did. It was 2 months later when Mark and Emily, a young couple eager to start their life in the city, found themselves standing in front of the same building, staring up at the crumbling structure with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They were tired of the suburbs, of the quiet, boring life they'd lived. Mark had just been promoted at work, and Emily was looking to make a fresh start, away from the small town that had stifled her dreams. The landlord, an old man who looked as though he'd been around for centuries, had welcomed them with a strange, knowing smile. He hadn't said much about the apartment's history, other than a few vague warnings about the place being a little quirky and not for everyone. But the rent was cheap, and it was perfect for them. So they moved in. Mark and Emily didn't believe in ghosts. They didn't care about the stories they'd heard. They were young, they were in love, and they were ready to carve out a life of their own. The apartment was theirs now, and yet, as the door closed behind them, there was a strange sensation in the air. A chill, a heaviness, as if the apartment were watching them. The first few days went by without incident. They unpacked, settled in, and tried to make the space their own. The apartment had a certain charm to it: high ceilings, old hardwood floors, and large windows that let in the natural light. The smell of old wood and dust was comforting, even if it was a little overpowering. But then the whispers started. Soft at first, like the rustling of paper or the sound of a distant conversation. Mark and Emily both chalked it up to the old building settling, but as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent and more distinct. Mark was the first to hear them clearly. He was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, when he heard the faint sound of a woman's voice, soft, almost pleading, but in a language he didn't understand. It was coming from the hallway. He got up, confused, and checked the hall. There was no one there, nothing out of the ordinary. Emily had been in the kitchen when Mark told her. She dismissed it immediately, brushing it off as his imagination. "Buildings settle, Mark. You're just hearing things," she said, her tone light but firm. But that night, as they lay in bed, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, closer. Emily woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Mark nodded, his face pale. It's coming from the walls." The sound of the whispers, the soft guttural murmurs, filled the apartment, reverberating off the walls, until it felt as though the very air was alive with the noise. And then, from the corner of the room, Emily saw it, the Hello Kitty doll. It sat on the shelf, where they'd placed it, but it was different now. Its eyes seemed darker, more hollow, its smile twisted into something grotesque. The room grew colder. Emily sat up, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Mark, it's watching us." Mark turned, his gaze locking on the doll. He had the distinct feeling that it wasn't just staring, it was waiting for something. He got up, walking toward it, despite the gnawing fear that crawled under his skin. He reached for the doll, his hand trembling. But just as his fingers brushed the cold ceramic, the apartment's lights flickered, and then they went out, plunging them into darkness. Emily screamed. The next morning, the light returned, but the sense of unease lingered. Mark and Emily tried to go about their day, but the apartment felt different now. The air was thick with something they couldn't explain, and the whispers, they had become louder, clearer. It wasn't long before they began to feel the presence of something else in the apartment, something that wasn't quite human. It started with strange occurrences, things moving on their own. A glass falling off the counter without explanation. The sound of footsteps in the hall when no one was there. the temperature dropping suddenly in one room, while the rest of the apartment remained warm. One night, Mark woke up to the feeling of being watched. The feeling was so intense that it was almost suffocating. He opened his eyes, his heart racing, and stared into the darkness. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but then he saw it, the Hello Kitty doll, sitting across the room. It wasn't on the shelf anymore. It was on the floor, staring at him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he sat up in bed. "Emily, Emily, wake up." But when he turned to her, he found her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "I can hear it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can hear her." Mark's blood ran cold. Who? The woman. The one who's been whispering. "She's here. She's in the room with us." He turned back to the doll, and that's when he saw it. The doll's smile had grown wider, and its eyes, they were no longer empty. They were filled with an unnatural, malicious light. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever, until it felt as though the very walls were vibrating with them. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist and stretch, as though they were alive. Emily screamed, covering her ears, but the sound wouldn't stop. It was too much. Too real. Mark rushed to the door, but when he tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. The apartment was locked, locked from the inside. "Please," Emily sobbed, her voice breaking. "Please, we need to leave. We have to get out." But it was too late. The next morning, the police arrived. Neighbors had reported hearing screams coming from apartment 3B, but when the officers broke down the door, they found only an empty apartment. No bodies, no signs of a struggle, nothing. The Hello Kitty doll sat on the couch, its smile twisted, its eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. Across the city, a new set of tenants was looking for an apartment. The landlord had already found another young couple eager to take 3 bites. The cycle, it seemed, was set to begin again. Weeks had passed since Mark and Emily's disappearance, but the mystery surrounding apartment 3B was far from over. Despite the police's investigation, no one had been able to explain what had happened inside. The building's landlord, a strange and reclusive man, offered no answers, simply stating that the apartment had always been difficult to keep tenants. The apartment was eventually rented out again to a new couple, Jack and Lisa, who had no idea what they were stepping into. Jack was an artist, always searching for inspiration in the darkness. Lisa, his girlfriend, was an architect, obsessed with old buildings and their histories. When they found the ad for apartment 3B, they were intrigued. It was affordable, in a prime location, and had the kind of vintage charm they both loved. They had heard the rumors, of course, the stories about the apartment being haunted, the eerie whispers, the strange disappearances. But Jack, ever the skeptic, dismissed them as urban legends. And Lisa, while more open to the idea of the supernatural, wasn't about to let a ghost story dictate her decisions. So, they signed the lease. The first few days were uneventful, just like every other tenant before them. They unpacked, settled in, and enjoyed the quietness of their new home. But it wasn't long before the atmosphere began to shift. The whispers started again, soft at first, barely noticeable. They sounded like a distant conversation, like someone talking just out of reach. Jack would often hear them while he worked on his sketches in the living room, and Lisa would hear them while she measured the walls of the apartment. At first, they thought it was just the building's creaks and groans. After all, old places had a way of making strange noises. But as time passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and then came the knocking. It was late one night when Jack first heard it. the distinct sound of knuckles rapping on wood. But when he looked, there was no one there. No one in the hallway, no one at the door. "Lisa," Jack said, his voice low and unsure. "Did you hear that?" Lisa looked up from her book, her brow furrowed. "What?" "The knocking," Jack said, his eyes wide. "It came from the door." Lisa got up, walked over to the door, and opened it. Nothing. The hallway was empty, the silence deafening. "It's just the house settling," she said, trying to reassure him. "It's an old building, Jack." But Jack wasn't convinced. The knocking had felt too real. The following night, they both heard it again. This time, the knocking was followed by a soft, high-pitched giggle, like that of a child. It echoed through the walls, reverberating around the apartment. Lisa couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, panic rising in her chest. "This place it's not right." But Jack, though uneasy, was determined to stay. He refused to let fear control him. Not when he'd already invested so much of himself into his art. He needed to finish his latest piece. And the apartment's haunting atmosphere seemed like the perfect inspiration. As he worked late into the night, Lisa's unease grew. She could feel it, something watching her, something lurking just beyond the corner of her vision. The air felt thick with a presence, something dark and ancient. And that night, as she lay in bed beside Jack, she heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice whispering her name, "Lisa." The voice came again the following night, louder this time. It was unmistakable. The voice of a woman, desperate, pleading, crying out in the darkness. Lisa bolted upright, her heart racing. She could hear it. The voice crying out for help, coming from somewhere deep within the walls of the apartment. "Jack," she screamed, shaking him awake. "Do you hear it? Do you hear her?" But Jack, ever the skeptic, remained silent, his eyes searching the room. "There's nothing there, Lisa. It's just your imagination." Lisa could feel the panic rising in her chest. She couldn't explain it. The voice, the whispers, the knocking. It was too much. There had to be something more to it. Something they were missing. The next day, Lisa did some research. She scoured old records, diving into the history of the building. What she uncovered was chilling. Apartment 3B hadn't always been a place for the living. In the 1920s, the building had been a boarding house. Its tenants were mostly travelers, passing through the city. But one night, a family moved in, a mother, father, and their young daughter. They were quiet, reclusive, and kept to themselves. But within a few months, the family disappeared without a trace. The landlord at the time had never reported their disappearance, and the authorities never followed up. Rumors circulated that the family had been involved in something dark, something evil. Some said the mother had been involved in occult practices. Others claimed she had summoned something terrible from beyond the grave, but no one knew for sure. What was certain, however, was that after their disappearance, strange things began to happen in the building. Tenants reported hearing the sound of a woman's voice crying out in the night. Others spoke of shadowy figures moving through the halls. Some even claimed to have seen a little girl, her eyes hollow and empty, standing in the doorway. And then the disappearances started. Lisa's heart raced as she read the accounts. It was all connected, the whispers, the giggles, the knocking. The curse of apartment 3B had been set long ago, and it was waiting for new tenants to feed it. She turned to Jack, who had been watching her with growing concern. "We have to leave. We're not safe here." Jack shook his head. "You're overreacting, Lisa. It's just a coincidence." But Lisa's voice trembled with fear. "No, Jack. It's real. The curse. It's real, and we're trapped." And then, as if to prove her point, the apartment went cold. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they were deafening. The knocking started again, followed by the giggles, the voice of a woman crying for help. But this time, it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the bathroom. Jack and Lisa rushed to the door of the bathroom, but when they opened it, the room was empty. No one was there, but the temperature had dropped drastically. The air was thick with a suffocating presence. And then they saw it, the Hello Kitty doll. It was standing on the bathroom counter, its grin wide, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. And in its reflection, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The little girl, the curse had come to claim them. Jack stared at the Hello Kitty doll on the bathroom counter, its grin widening impossibly, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. His heart slammed against his ribs as he reached out, his hands trembling. Lisa stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide, lips trembling in fear. The air in the room was suffocating, cold, almost biting. "Jack," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." But Jack was rooted to the spot, staring at the empty counter where the doll had been moments ago. His mind struggled to comprehend what had just happened. It didn't make sense. The knocking returned. It was louder now, almost as if it was coming from every direction at once. The sound reverberated through the walls, the ceiling, the floors, and then the giggle. It echoed like a child's laugh, twisted and cruel, a sound that clawed at their sanity. "Please, Jack, let's leave," Lisa begged, her voice breaking, but it was too late. The apartment seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, like dark fingers reaching toward them. Jack's head spun, his vision blurring as he tried to focus. The walls seemed to close in, and then, without warning, everything went silent. Too silent. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the bathroom mirror, her face pale with terror. In the reflection, she saw it. The little girl, her hollow eyes stared back at them, her face pale and twisted in agony. She was standing in the corner of the bathroom, just beyond the door, her mouth open in a silent scream. "Jack, do you see her?" Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. But when Jack turned to look, there was nothing there, only the empty, cold bathroom. Lisa reached out, her hand shaking as she grabbed Jack's arm. "We have to leave, now." They ran through the apartment, desperate to escape. But when they reached the front door, they found it locked. Locked from the inside. Jack tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him, and his mind raced. They were trapped. Trapped inside with whatever haunted this place. The apartment was alive now, the walls vibrating with the whispers. The floor creaking underfoot, as if something massive was moving beneath them. And then, in the middle of the chaos, the voice came again. The woman's voice. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. "Help, please." Lisa's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. What is this? Why is this happening to us?" Jack knelt beside her, his eyes wild with fear. "We need to figure out how to get out of here," he said, his voice tight. "We need to find a way to break the curse." But as he spoke, the whispers grew louder, clearer. They were no longer just sounds. They were words. "Find the girl." Jack's heart stopped. "Find the girl," he repeated, confused. "What does that mean?" The whispers continued. "Find the girl before it's too late." Suddenly, The air turned ice cold, and Jack felt something cold and unnatural brush against his skin. He spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only the darkness, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. And then a voice, not from the walls, not from the air, but from behind him. Jack. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. There, standing in the doorway, was the girl. Her face was pale and twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. She was beckoning to them, her thin, trembling hand raised toward them. Jack and Lisa couldn't move. Their bodies were frozen, paralyzed by fear. And then, as if in a nightmare, the girl stepped forward. She was no longer a little girl. She was something else. Her body was contorting, stretching unnaturally, her limbs jerking in grotesque, impossible angles. The sound of cracking bones filled the air as she slowly, painfully walked toward them. Her face twisted in agony, her mouth still open in that silent scream, but now her eyes gleamed with malevolent intelligence. "Run," the whispers hissed, louder now. "Run, or die." But it was too late. With a scream, Jack grabbed Lisa's hand, yanking her toward the door. But no matter how hard he pulled, the door wouldn't open. It was as though the walls themselves had locked them in, trapping them in this hellish nightmare. And then the girl lunged. Her twisted body seemed to stretch and elongate, her fingers sharp as knives. She grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward her, her cold, clammy fingers digging into his flesh. Lisa screamed, trying to pull him away, but the girl was impossibly strong. "Help, please," Jack gasped, trying to free himself. But the girl's grip tightened, and with a horrifying screech, she pulled Jack toward her, her mouth opening wider, impossibly wide. It was as if she were about to swallow him whole. Lisa couldn't think. She couldn't move. She was frozen, watching in horror as Jack was pulled into the darkness, his scream echoing through the apartment. Everything went quiet. The room was still. Lisa was alone. Her heart was racing, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. She collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe it. Jack was gone, swallowed by the thing that haunted this place. The girl, the curse, it had claimed him. Lisa's mind was spinning, but then, through the haze of panic, she remembered the whispers. Find the girl. She had to find the girl. The girl who was the key to breaking the curse. But where? She stood up, trembling, her legs shaking beneath her. She had to do it. She had to find the truth before it was too late. And then, the door to the bathroom opened. Inside, the Hello Kitty doll was sitting on the counter again, its grin wide, its eyes glowing in the dark. But there, in the corner, stood the girl. Her hollow eyes stared at Lisa, her mouth open in a silent scream. "Help me." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The girl wasn't just a spirit. She was a part of it, the curse. She had to help her. She had to save them all. But could she? Lisa's heart raced as she stood frozen, staring at the girl in the bathroom. The thing that had once been a child was now a twisted version of something unnatural. Her hollow eyes locked onto Lisa's with a chilling, unearthly gaze. The girl's mouth opened wider, as if to speak, but no sound came. Her hands twitched, long, bony fingers stretching toward Lisa with unnatural speed. "Help me." The voice was a whisper, but it echoed through Lisa's mind like a scream. She took a step back, her legs shaking beneath her. The apartment felt as if it were closing in, the walls pulsating with an energy that made her skin crawl. The air was thick, heavy with something ancient and malevolent. The girl's form flickered, her body a shadow, like a reflection in a broken mirror. "Why are you doing this?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The girl's twisted mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "I want freedom." The air seemed to grow colder, the temperature plummeting to a point where Lisa could see her breath in the air. She could hear the whispers again, louder, like 1,000 voices crowding around her, each one pleading, begging for release. "Find the girl," they repeated. "Find the girl." Lisa's mind was spinning. What girl? Was it the little girl standing before her now? Or was there something deeper, something older? The curse had to have a source, a reason, and if she was going to break it, she needed to understand. She took another step back, her eyes never leaving the girl. "How do I help you? How do I break the curse?" The girl's form flickered again, her image warping as if struggling to hold together. "You cannot break it. It is too late," she whispered, her voice low and guttural. "I am the curse. I am what they all left behind." Lisa's pulse quickened. The truth was starting to form in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The family from the 1920s, the occult practices, the disappearances, the curse that had been set in motion long ago. The little girl had not been the victim. She was the one who had unleashed it. Lisa stepped forward, her fear replaced with a deep, burning resolve. She wasn't going to let this evil take her. She wasn't going to let it win. "You're not the only one trapped here," Lisa said, her voice firm, even as her fear gripped her chest. "This curse doesn't just affect you. It's taken so many before me. It's taken Jack. It's taken others. But I'm not going to let it take me." The girl's twisted smile faded, her eyes narrowing as if trying to understand Lisa's words. "You think you can stop it?" she asked, her voice laced with malice. "You think you can free them? You are all trapped, just like I am." "I don't care what you were," Lisa spat. "I care about what I'm going to become if I don't break this curse. And I will." Suddenly, the room seemed to grow darker, and the girl's form seemed to stretch impossibly long, her figure engulfing the bathroom in shadows. The air grew even colder, until Lisa could barely breathe. Her skin prickled, her eyes stinging from the frigid temperature. "You can't escape," the girl whispered, her voice turning into a guttural growl. "You can't escape what's already been set in motion." Lisa's mind raced. She needed to act. She needed to do something. In her mind, a memory flashed, a memory of the research she had done. The family from the 1920s, the occult practices, the ritual that had gone horribly wrong. They had tried to summon something, but they had summoned her instead. The curse wasn't just about the girl. It was about what she had become, a manifestation of the family's greed, their desperation to control forces beyond their understanding. Lisa remembered the words she had found in the old records. To break the curse, you must sever the tie. You must break the bond of the girl's soul to the land. Lisa's heart pounded as she understood. The curse wasn't just tied to the girl. It was tied to the apartment itself. The land, the foundation, the place where the ritual had been performed. The curse could only be broken if the bond between the girl's spirit and the apartment was severed. But how? Her eyes scanned the room, and then they landed on the Hello Kitty doll. She had seen it before, sitting innocently on the bathroom counter, its eyes glowing in the dark. The doll wasn't just a toy, it was a vessel. A connection between the girl's spirit and the curse that had been placed on this building. Lisa took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she had left. She stepped forward, her hands shaking as she reached for the doll. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. "No," The girl shrieked, "Don't touch it." But it was too late. Lisa grabbed the doll, and in that instant, the entire apartment seemed to tremble. The walls cracked, the floorboards groaned as if the very foundation of the building were coming apart. The girl screamed, her form flickering and distorting as if the very essence of her soul were being ripped away. You can't break the curse." But Lisa held firm, her fingers clutching the doll as if it were the last lifeline she had. She had to finish it. She had to sever the tie once and for all. The ground beneath her feet cracked wide open, and from the darkness a light began to shine, blinding, brilliant, pure. For the first time, the girl stopped screaming. She seemed to freeze, her form trembling, her twisted smile fading. And then, with one final, blood-curdling screech, the girl's form shattered. Everything went still. The apartment was silent, the darkness lifting as the temperature returned to normal. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight that had hung over Lisa lifting like a storm clearing. Lisa dropped to her knees, gasping for breath, the Hello Kitty doll still clutched in her hands. She had done it. The curse was broken, but the cost had been high. Jack was gone. The others who had been claimed by the curse were gone, but Lisa was free. As she stumbled out of the bathroom, the apartment seemed to shift, as if the very walls were sighing in relief. The whispers were gone. The evil had been vanquished. But Lisa knew that she could never return to this place. She had faced the darkness and won, but she couldn't stay in the place where it had all begun. She would leave, and she would never look back. And so, Lisa walked out of apartment 3B for the last time, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. But as she stepped out into the night, a chilling thought crossed her mind. The curse had been broken, but who would be next?